All right. Hello, everybody. I am just outside today enjoying this lovely August weather. Um, and I'm ready to talk about the Euthyphro. I hope you are too. All right. Let's see here. View. All righty. So let's recap what we talked about last time. So recall that Euthyphro and Socrates are visiting the king's court. They are both there for different reasons. So Euthyphro is there to try his own father, and Socrates is there because he is being tried, which we will read about more in the Apology, which we'll read for next time. Okay, so they strike up a conversation. They say, "Hey, how are you? How's the wife and kids?" And then they start talking about important stuff like what's the definition of piety. Okay, so the idea is that they're after the common pious making feature for all pious actions, right? What explains why some action is pious and some action is not? What feature do the pious actions all share and the impious actions don't share? So they've already talked about two problematic definitions, right? So the first thing that Euthyphro says is, well, piety is just what I'm doing right now. You got to prosecute your father, and that's piety. And Socrates says, well, aren't there other pious acts, right? And if there are, which there are, then that means that you've merely given an example, right? An example is not a definition, right? Um, a definition will explain why examples are examples of certain things, right? But examples in and of themselves are not definitions. That's important. Okay, and then there was a second problematic definition that Euthyphro gave. It says that piety is what the gods hold dear. Recall, Socrates criticized this definition by saying that the gods might hold very different things dear to themselves. So, for example, um, it may be that Zeus loves burnt sacrifices and some other god loves another method of sacrifice, right? So when you act piously to Zeus, you act impiously towards the other god, right? And so you can't please all of the gods, or more specifically, the criticism is when you act piously, you can also act impiously at the same time. And that's a contradiction, and that's not what we're after. That's a bad definition. Okay, so I asked you to think about two questions for this time, um, to understand the difference between something's being loved by the gods because it is pious and something's being pious because it is loved by the gods. This is what we're going to call the order of explanation, right? Which facts explain these other facts? Which facts are doing the explaining and which facts are being explained? That's a super important question. We'll talk more about it. And the other thing is can you say in your own words what Euthyphro's third answer is and what the problem with his answer is? So if you can do both of those things, you're going to be in really good shape, especially for the exams and this and that. So get ready. All right, Euthyphro gives his third answer, and it's that the pious is what all of the gods love, and the opposite, what all the gods hate, is impious, right? So this definition, or this answer, is sufficient to sidestep Socrates' last criticism, right? Which is that some gods value X, other gods value Y, they value different things, and so you can't be pious to one and be pious to the other, right? Well, this is saying that, well, whatever it is that all of the gods hold dear, or all of the gods love, that's the pious stuff, right? So if you have all the gods that love X, but one God doesn't love X, that's not a pious thing. It's got to be all the gods are all on board for whatever is pious. And so you can see where Euthyphro avoids Socrates' last criticism. Okay, but Socrates poses a question or a dilemma. Is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Ooh, this is the order of explanation, right? So, is something made pious by the fact that the gods love it, or do the gods love the thing because it's pious? So think about the following analogy, right? Okay, do I eat a sandwich because it is delicious, or is the sandwich delicious because I eat it, right? Those are two similar statements, right? But they're very different in meaning, and it's because they're flipping the order of explanation, right? It strongly seems like I eat the sandwich because it's delicious, right? It has a feature intrinsic to itself that I'm responding to. Whereas in the other case, it's delicious because I eat it. That would mean that the property of being delicious is somehow bestowed upon it from me. And that doesn't seem quite right? There's something about the sandwich itself, a feature about the sandwich in which I am responding to it by eating it. But we'll make that distinction a little later. But this is an example to kind of help make this discussion a little more concrete. Okay, so the first option is the pious, or that which is pious because the gods love it, right? So the fact that the gods love something explains the fact that something is pious, okay? This would be like saying the sandwich is delicious because I ate it, right? So my eating the sandwich explains why the sandwich is delicious. In a similar way, the gods love it explains the fact why it is pious, okay? Good. So here's another example. So making burnt offerings is pious. Why? You might ask, oh, well, why is making burnt sacrifice pious? And I'm going to say, well, it's because all of the gods love the smell of burning antelope or burning deer, whatever. They all agree that the smell of a burning deer is a great smell, and so they all love it. Okay, and it's because they all love it that burning a sacrificial deer, is pious, right? So you see that the love, the God lovedness, is explaining the piousness in this option. All right, let's talk about the second option. All right, the gods love what is pious because of its piousness. Okay, this is the idea that the gods are responding to some kind of intrinsic feature about pious things. Namely, piety is somehow in the thing itself, and the gods love it. Why the gods love it? Well, because it's pious, right? This is kind of analogous to I eat the sandwich because it's delicious. You ask me, Spencer, why'd you eat that sandwich? And I say, well, because the sandwich was delicious. There's something in the sandwich itself, some kind of intrinsic property, namely being delicious, that I'm responding to. In a similar way, the gods are responding with love to what is pious. So that's the idea. So the example here, so you might ask, on this account or this option, why is animal sacrifice pious? Well, it's because maybe the smell is objectively wonderful, and there's some kind of intrinsic righteousness or some kind of intrinsic good of the act, right? Which just elicits the response from the gods to love animal sacrifice. The idea is that there's something about animal sacrifice itself that the gods love. The there's some kind of piousness within animal sacrifice that the gods respond with love, instead of the first option, which says that animal sacrifice is pious because of the fact that the gods love it, right? Okay. So Euthyphro doesn't get this, right? And so if you're with Euthyphro, that's okay. Euthyphro's a smart guy. He gets a little confused. It's all right. It's okay if you're confused by this. Um, but he goes with option two, which says that something is pious because of its piousness, or the gods love something that is pious because of its piousness. So he goes with the intrinsic option. Okay, so Socrates is trying to push back a little bit. Okay, so he makes a couple of analogies. There's an analogy between something being carried, or something carrying, and another thing being carried, something leading, another thing being led, and something seeing, and another thing being seen. Okay. So Socrates wants to make the claim that the action, namely carrying, leading, seeing, explains being carried, being led, being seen, right? So we might think that the order of explanation is, well, the thing is being carried, and that explains that something is carrying it. Socrates says, no. Something's carrying something else explains why that other thing is being carried. So the action explains the property, right? Because being carried is a property. So the action of carrying explains why something has a feature of being carried, right? So I have my pen here. Holding my pen. My holding the pen explains the fact that the pen is being held by me, right? By the holder. And that's how we ought to understand the order of explanation between actions and properties, right? That stand in this kind of relation. So the actions, carrying, holding, seeing, all explain being held, being carried, being seen, all that kind of stuff. Okay. Right. So like I was saying earlier, this is, these are actions. Carrying, leading, seeing are all actions. Being carried is something that happens to someone else. It's a property that happens to you, right? Hit in the face, and then the person is hit in the face, right? Or I'm going to punch you, and then the person being punched. One's an action. The other is something that's being received. And the idea is that the actions explain their effects, or the actions explain properties that stem from that action to other objects. Okay, so Socrates wants to then say that loving is the same way. So something's being loved is explained by what? You say, why is that thing being loved? Well, I would say, because something is loving it, right? So loving something in a manner similar to carrying or leading or seeing explains why something is being loved. Okay. Now, recall that Euthyphro thinks that being loved by the gods is what makes it pious, right? Okay, so it would follow from that that the gods loving explains why something is being pious, just like it explains why something is being loved. Okay, but Euthyphro doesn't want to go with this option, right? So Euthyphro goes with option 2. If he were to go with option 1, he might not be in a problem, right? But he wants to say that the gods love what is pious, not because they love it, but because it has a characteristic of being pious, right? There's some kind of feature that's already in the object that the gods respond to with love. And this is where he does it. I'm not going to read this, but this is just for your reference, right? Okay. And so you might be thinking, well, what's the big deal with picking option 2? Well, here's the problem. So let's suppose that the gods love what is pious because of its piousness, right? Because of the feature that it already has. If we say this, then it's not the fact that something is loved by the gods that makes it pious, right? The thing is already pious. And so the gods are just responding to that thing with love, right? So it's a feature that's just kind of out there in the world, right? And we respond to it with different ways, right? Our response does not make it what it is. That's kind of the idea here. So the tree is green, right? Suppose green is my favorite color, and I respond to it with love. I love the tree because it's green. It's not green because I love it, right? Those are the kind of things, those, analogies. Okay, and so if we accept this, right, if we accept the relationship between love and piety, okay, if we take option 2, then we haven't really given a definition of what piety is. That is, we have not explained why it's pious. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, just email me. We can have a chat. But the idea is that the piousness explains why the gods love it. The gods loving it does not explain why it's pious. That's the idea. And so we are back to the drawing board. We don't have a definition of piety. Nothing. We got zilch, right? Or at least we were able to rule out this one possibility. Okay. So it's going to be helpful here to differentiate between extrinsic and intrinsic properties, right? So a property is extrinsic to a thing if the object doesn't change when it loses that property, right? So presumably, if we understand, or how about this? The gods loving animal sacrifice, right? Suppose all of a sudden that no gods loved animal sacrifice. Potentially, animal sacrifice is not going to change, right? There's a property that it has, namely being loved by the gods, right? It's got that property. But if it loses that property, well, then that means that that it doesn't, it's not changing in any relevant kind of way, right? Suppose I love the sandwich because it's delicious, right? Okay. If I love the sandwich, if I suppose I stop loving the sandwich for some reason, the sandwich hasn't changed at all, but it's lost a relevant feature. Okay. And these are supposed to be differentiated from intrinsic properties, which are properties that some object will lose. If some object loses this property, then the object will change in a relevant kind of way, right? So suppose that the sandwich loses its deliciousness. We might think that that means that there's some kind of change in the sandwich itself. Maybe it got mold on it. Nobody wants to eat mold, so the mold's not delicious, right? So there was a change about the sandwich uh, in virtue of losing the characteristic deliciousness. So anyway, we might think of piousness as an intrinsic characteristic, right, that we respond to in a relevant kind of way, that if it were to lose its piousness, the object would change. Or we could think about piety as an extrinsic property, kind of like being loved, right? If it loses its piety, if something loses its pious nature, that means that it doesn't change in a relevant kind of way. And so I think Socrates wants to bring out that piousness has to be an intrinsic property. All right, let's think about the fourth answer here. Okay, so we've gotten rid of the third answer, the Euthyphro dilemma, all of these kinds of things. And Socrates kind of puts this one in Euthyphro's mouth. I think Euthyphro's kind of scratching his head at the end of the back and forth with the third answer, and Euthyphro wants to say that the pious or pious actions are a subset of just actions, right? So imagine there's a broad category of actions that are just, okay? There's going to be a subset of that category, a smaller number of those just actions that are also pious actions. So, okay, so you might say, well, what is that subset of just actions that are also pious actions? Well, these are actions that involve care for the gods, right? So any just action that deals with care for the gods is automatically a pious action. Okay. Okay, fair enough. This seems like a good definition. Like maybe we can work with it. But Socrates, being Socrates, doesn't really want that. So he focuses on what the definition of care is, right? So piety is just acts that deal with care for the gods. So what is care? Care seems to be benefit. If we understand care as a kind of benefit or making better off or bringing about the good of, well, then we run into a problem, right? So I get sick. My grandmother takes care of me, right? Well, what do we mean when we say that? Well, we say that my grandmother makes me better off. My grandmother benefits me, right? She's helping me in some way. I need something. My grandmother's helping me get that something that I need, right? So care seems to involve some kind of privation, right? If somebody's going to respond to me with care, that means that I need something. Okay. So what about the gods, though? Do the gods really need anything from us, from the mortals, right? Especially if you put this in a Judeo-Christian context, right? I mean, God's like omniscient, omnipotent, like, doesn't need a thing, has no privations, right? Okay, so can we really make either God or the gods better off with our piety? Can we really care for them on this definition? And the answer is no. Like the gods don't need what we are offering them is the idea. Okay, so let's think about like how we might modify this response. I think this response is super interesting. So let's change the definition of justice from care to giving somebody what they're owed. So let's just suppose that justice is, rather than care for humans and gods, is giving somebody what they're owed. Okay? And let's run with the assumption that Euthyphro makes that piety is a part of justice. So, okay, so it is the case that the pious is also the just, but the just is not always the pious, kind of like what we were saying earlier. So if that's the case, if we accept both of these assumptions, well, that would make piety as a kind of compensation or a kind of giving somebody what they're owed. Okay? So rather than understanding piety as care for the gods, piety would be giving unto the gods what they are owed. And maybe we owe them a lot, right? Maybe they've given us existence and blessed us and done all of these things for us, been looking after us, been thinking about it, all of that stuff. So if we accept piety as a kind of giving to somebody else for what they owe us, right? Um, you loan me $10. Justice demands that I give you what you're owed, which would be $10, right? Um, uh, we might think that we can owe somebody who really doesn't need anything from us. So suppose that I borrow 50 cents from like a millionaire, right? And justice might still demand that I pay that guy back, right? But suppose that he's so rich that having 50 more cents is not going to affect him in any kind of way, right? It's not going to actually benefit him. He just has so much money that 50 cents really doesn't matter at all. I might still owe him 50 cents, even if it doesn't benefit him necessarily, right? And so, in a similar way, even though we owe the gods all kinds of stuff, and even though that stuff isn't going to benefit them, we still owe it to them to give them those things, right? And so Socrates' worry that we were talking about, the fact that we can't benefit the gods, we can sidestep it with this. So it could be that we can salvage Euthyphro's fourth answer. All right, now let's talk about the fifth and final answer. Okay, so Euthyphro wants to say that piety is giving to the gods, knowing what to give the gods, and how to get from the gods, right? It's kind of trading. It's knowledge of how to trade with the gods, how to get what you want from them, and how to give them what they want. That's all it is. It's this transactional understanding of piety. Socrates responds. So recall that we said that the gods can't benefit, or that we can't benefit the gods. Maybe the gods can benefit one another, right? But we can't benefit them. We're just not powerful enough to, suppose. So why do we trade with the gods, right? So we've already said okay, so on this definition, piety is giving unto the gods and receiving from the gods and knowing how to do that. Well, why would we trade with the gods? Why would we give them anything? Socrates asks. Euthyphro thinks that we trade what is most dear to the gods, right? So we give the gods what is dear to them. All right, but that's a problem, because this is the very definition of piety that Socrates and Euthyphro rejected at the outset of the dialogue, that the pious just is what is most dear to the gods, right? And so we've come almost full circle, right? Or it's one of the first definitions, but we've almost come full circle. Because he is offering yet another definition of piety that is in some way incompatible with what they've said before, right? They've already rejected this assumption. And so the dialogue ends, and Socrates is really frustrated. He says, hey, we already got rid of that definition. And then Euthyphro kind of seems to be kind of frustrated and goes to court. And Socrates also seems frustrated and says, you could have given me what I needed to make my court case against Miletus, and you could have saved me. But sadly, Socrates doesn't get what he wants. So at the end of this dialogue, you're probably feeling confused, tangled up in knots, dizzy, right? I know I was when I first read it, and still do, right? It's dense. It's a lot to take in, but this is actually the right kind of response. It's a response that we ought to feel because these dialogues were written to be that way, right? And so this is what the Greeks call aporia, which is a knot or a puzzle. And so it ends in an aporium. It feels like we have more questions than we do answers, right? Um, and so you might be asking yourself, what's the point of walking away with more questions than answers? Well, this is actually just like a statement about philosophy itself. We are making progress about philosophical questions if we can reject some answers, right? So Socrates and Euthyphro have rejected 5 potential definitions, potential candidates of a definition for piety, right? They've ruled them out. Okay, that's progress. That's progress in our discipline, right? We don't come to any full certain answers, at least, not outright. It takes a lot of time. And so the dialogue is kind of appreciating this relevant feature of philosophy. And so progress has been made, right? You might feel frustrated because you didn't learn what piety is from this dialogue. Well, you did learn that piety is not these 5 things. And so that can be just or nearly as important as actually coming to a conclusion about piety. So anyway, we're going to move on to the apology for next time. Uh, you're going to have similar reactions, I think, and it's going to be fun. So anyway,